The summer of 1878. A locomotive shed on the Northern Railway of France. An American engine sits under a French roof that will not clear it. Philadelphia and Reading number 412 shipped across the Atlantic for the Paris Exposition with a firebox 9 feet wide and a cab perched on top of it. The French cannot run it as built, so they cut the cab loose, drop it down, and move it forward until it sits astride the boiler barrel, with the driving rods turning directly underneath the floor. That fix stayed on American railroads for the next 77 years. The most dangerous cab in American railroading was never designed. It was improvised once by foreign shopmen to clear a foreign structure. Did your family work the anthracite roads out of Reading, Jersey City, or Scranton? Put the road and the years in the comments. This is what American Iron Works covers. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. To understand why an American railroad kept that arrangement, you have to start with a waste pile. Anthracite is hard coal. It burns slowly, with almost no flame and almost no smoke, and in the 1870s, it heated most of the homes in the northeastern United States. Before it could be sold, it had to be screened. The lumps went to market. Everything small went into a heap behind the breaker. That waste was called culm. It came to almost 20% of everything the mines produced. It had no commercial value at all. The piles grew into hills, and the hills grew into small black mountains, sitting on land the coal companies already owned and paying nothing back. The Reading was not a bystander to that waste. In 1871, its president, Franklin B. Gowan, organized the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company for the express purpose of buying mines, and he kept buying until the railroad controlled the coal it hauled. The debt he took on to do it put the company into receivership by 1880. So the Reading entered the 1870s owning the mines, owning the track, owning the market, and owning several million tons of screened-off rubbish it had no use for whatsoever. John E. Wootten had been looking at those piles for years. He started in 1837 as an apprentice at the Baldwin Locomotive Works. In 1845, he joined a railroad that would become part of the Philadelphia and Reading. He became superintendent of motive power in 1866 and general manager of the whole system 10 years later. He was not a theorist. He was a shopman who had spent 30 years around fireboxes, and he understood the problem better than almost anyone alive. Culm would not burn in a normal locomotive firebox. The firebox of that era was long and narrow, squeezed between the frames and under the boiler, and it needed a thick fire and a hard draft. Push a hard draft through fine anthracite and the fuel does not burn. It lifts off the grate and goes straight up the stack. Wootten worked out that culm needed the opposite treatment. A thin layer, spread wide, a light draft. Slow, patient combustion across a very large area, which meant the grate had to get enormous. There was no room for it between the driving wheels, so Wootten put it above them, wider than the wheels themselves, sitting up on top of the frames where nothing that size had ever gone before. He had no other option. The trailing truck, the small pair of wheels that would later carry a wide firebox safely behind the drivers, had not been invented yet. The firebox that came out of this is a genuinely strange piece of engineering, and the details matter. It was so wide that one fire door could not reach across it, so Wootten fitted two. The grate was built from water tubes, hollow pipes carrying boiler water straight through the fire, which kept the bars from burning out under a fuel that left heavy ash. In front of the grate, he built an auxiliary combustion chamber that reached forward into the boiler barrel, with a fire brick wall standing across the back of it. There was one more constraint working against him. Railroad men of the 1870s were afraid of a high boiler. A high boiler meant a high center of gravity, and a high center of gravity meant a locomotive that would roll off a curve. Everyone knew this. So Wootten kept the throat of the firebox extremely shallow, threading his enormous grate above the wheels while holding the whole boiler as low as he could get it. He was solving for stability. He was not solving for the two men who had to work the thing. On December 21, 1876, Wootten signed a statement for the Reading's annual report. He wrote that the company had begun using coal dirt from the waste heaps to raise steam in stationary boilers at its shops and stations, that a locomotive burning the same fuel was already doing efficient service, and that nearly 7,000 tons of the waste had been profitably consumed during the year. 7,000 tons of garbage burned for free in 1 year before the design was even finished. In January of 1877, the reading shops turned out engine number 408, a 10-wheeler, 18 by 24-inch cylinders, 54-inch drivers, and a boiler built specifically to burn refuse coal. The patent came through on July 3rd of that year, number 192,725. One claim, describing a firebox wider than the distance between the driving wheels with a grate as wide or wider arranged above them. Nothing in that patent says a word about where the crew stands. A second patent followed on March 7, 1882, number 258,581, claiming that the entire firebox should sit above the bottom line of the boiler barrel. And here is the part that gets left out of every telling. The first Wootten engines put the cab exactly where cabs belong. At the rear, on top of the firebox, both men together, both men looking forward over the boiler. That is how 412 was built when it left Reading for Paris. The engine was sent to Europe as a demonstration piece, and it worked. After the exposition, it was tried on the Northern Railway of France and then on several Italian roads, where it burned low-grade fuel that nothing else on those systems could handle. Wootten had built a machine that could eat garbage on 2 continents, but French structures sat lower than American ones. To get 412 under them, the cab had to come down, and the only place to put it was forward of the firebox, straddling the barrel above the rods. Paul T. Warner, the Baldwin Locomotive Works historian who wrote the definitive account of the anthracite burner, names that modification as probably the first of the long line later nicknamed camelbacks or Mother Hubbards. An American railroad watched a foreign shop solve a foreign clearance problem, looked at the result, and decided it liked the view from up there. The design was ugly, it was strange, and within 20 years it was carrying passengers at 70 miles an hour on the fastest schedules in the United States. The anthracite roads bought it by the thousand. They did not do it for the speed. The reason is sitting in a column of figures the Reading published about itself. On December 31, 1881, the Reading's general manager filed his annual report. In it, he gave the fuel cost per 100-ton miles for 2 classes of freight locomotive running on the same railroad in the same year. A 10-wheeler burning, prepared coal, the sized product that customers paid money for, cost 5.6 cents. A consolidation burning waste coal cost 0.6 cents. Not 6% cheaper, not 60% cheaper. 1/9 of the price, on fuel the company was otherwise paying men to shovel into a heap. That number doesn't fit the story most people know about this locomotive. Which surprises you more, that the saving was that large, or that the railroad printed it in public? The report put the annual fuel saving at about $2,500 for every single consolidation converted. By 1883, the Reading had 171 locomotives burning waste anthracite. That year alone, the fuel bill dropped by $378,000. With numbers like that on the table, every anthracite road in Pennsylvania should have converted inside 5 years. Most of them refused for a decade, and the reason had nothing to do with the crew. The Wootten boiler was patented property, and using it meant paying a competitor. The Lehigh Valley bought 2 consolidations with the boiler in 1880, and then went straight back to building narrow firebox passenger engines in its own shops. Southeastern, Hazleton, Weatherly, Delano, Wilkes-Barre, Sayre. Every master mechanic drew his own. Angus Sinclair later described the result as an accumulation of patents such as no other railroad company ever possessed. The safer arrangement lost that argument on a licensing fee. The dangerous one won it on fuel cost. The man standing on the tender deck was not a variable in either column. Now, follow where the money actually sat. In 1871, the railroad had organized the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company to buy and operate mines. By the end of that campaign, it controlled more than 40% of the anthracite reserves in the United States. The company that owned the waste piles was the company that owned the locomotives that burned them. The Reading was not buying cheap fuel from somebody else. It was reaching into its own backyard and taking something it had already written off as worthless. The fuel was not even clean. As it came from the mines, it carried 18 to 20% slate and rock. The Reading tried burning it exactly as delivered. Crews ended up cleaning fires so many times a trip that the engines could not hold a schedule, and the railroad started washing the refuse before it went on the tender. That is the machine. A locomotive that ate the mine's garbage and turned it into a train. And every one of them put a man on top of the rods. Look at what the engineer sat over. 2 main rods and a set of side rods, forged steel, 30 pounds, and more apiece, sweeping through a full circle several times a second at speed, directly beneath the cab floor. If one let go, it went up. On the Baltimore and Ohio, the crews had a name for these engines. They called them snappers, after a breaking crosshead or a broken main rod. Behind the engineer, on the other side of a wall of boiler and firebox, the fireman stood alone. He had no cab. He had a roof over the tender deck and nothing at his sides in January in Pennsylvania at speed. He could not see the engineer. The engineer could not see him. 2 men ran that locomotive and neither one could tell what the other was doing. The B&O Railroad Museum states plainly that on more than one occasion a camelback engineer was killed in his cab while the fireman, unaware, kept stoking the fire. I went looking for those men. I could not find them. No name, no date, no railroad, no engine number, no coroner's finding, no accident bulletin. The claim appears on museum placards and in enthusiast writing, repeated with confidence and sourced to nothing. The Interstate Commerce Commission investigated side rod failures on conventional locomotives and published the reports. For the camelback, the specific case that everyone describes has no paperwork behind it that I could locate. That absence bothers me more than a body count would, because everything else about these engines is documented down to the decimal. We know the cylinder dimensions. We know the fuel cost to 1/10 of a cent. We know how many tons of culm went up the stack in 1876. The Reading counted everything it cared about, and it cared about coal. Now hold that against what the machine actually did on the road. In 1880, the Reading shops turned out engines 411 and 506, 4 4-0 types, 21 by 22-inch cylinders, 68-inch drivers, and a Wootten grate of 76 square feet. They were the heaviest passenger locomotives in the country when they were built. At full power, one of them burned 53 pounds of anthracite a minute, just under a pound of coal every second, thrown by hand, while the engine evaporated 55 gallons of water in the same 60 seconds. No man alive could keep that up alone. So the Reading put 3 men on the engine and gave the third one a single duty. He opened and closed the fire door. That was the job. Wotten's own description of it was that the operation facilitates rapid firing. Somewhere in Reading, Pennsylvania, in 1880, there was a working man whose entire occupation was a doorknob. What those crews produced was the fastest scheduled running in America. In the summer of 1897, the Reading put on a train between Philadelphia and Atlantic City with 1 hour in the timetable. Ferry crossing included. Engine 1027 pulled it. 55.5 miles. It ran every weekday through July and August. It was never once late. The best time was 46.5 minutes, start to stop. That is an average of 71.6 miles an hour on a locomotive burning washed mine waste in 1897. The Pennsylvania Railroad watched this happen on its own doorstep and answered with a Class D16A, a locomotive that many people still consider one of the finest American 440s ever built. It had more total heating surface than the Reading engine. It had more weight on its drivers. It had less than half the grate area. It could not match the schedule. The standard railroad of the world lost a straight fight to a machine burning coal that nobody else would buy, and it did not lose on craftsmanship. It lost on square feet of fire. The Pennsylvania eventually stopped building hard coal burners entirely, narrowed its fireboxes, moved its cabs to the rear where they were safe, and went to soft coal. Which brings us to the sentence on nearly every museum placard in the country. The Interstate Commerce Commission banned the camelback because it was too dangerous. That sentence may not be true. The standard version runs like this. In 1918, the ICC banned further construction, allowed a few exceptions into the early 1920s, and in 1927 prohibited any further orders on grounds of safety. You will find it on museum collection pages, in reference entries, in popular articles going back decades. You will also find it quoted, word for word, on one of the most careful camelback reference sites in existence for the specific purpose of stating that no research has found evidence to support it. I went after the order myself. The Locomotive Inspection Act of February 17, 1911 is on the record, along with its amendments of March 4, 1915 and June 7, 1924. The Commission amended Rule 23 of its inspection rules by order of July 28, 1925. Those documents exist and are catalogued. I could not find a single ICC order banning the center cab. What I did find was a fuel market falling apart underneath the design. After 1908, stokers built for industry made small anthracite useful to buyers who had never wanted it before. Culm stopped being garbage. Its price climbed, and then it climbed above the price of soft bituminous coal, which is the exact moment the entire economic argument for the wide grate collapsed. Then came the mechanical stoker on locomotives. As engines grew, hand firing became impossible, and a stoker became mandatory at the top end of the roster. A locomotive stoker cannot practicably fire straight anthracite, so the anthracite roads began mixing in bituminous coal and then burning bituminous outright, in fireboxes that had been shaped for something else entirely. The stoker did one more thing. Its machinery sat under the cab floor and raised the whole cab several inches, and from that new height, an engineer at the rear of a modern locomotive could see forward past the boiler again. The trailing truck finished it. The small wheels Wootten did not have in 1877 could now carry a firebox of any width behind the drivers, at the back of the engine, where a cab belonged and where the rods could not reach it. Every single reason the center cab existed was gone. Baldwin built the last new camelback in 1927 for the Lehigh and New England. Across 50 years, close to 3,000 center cab and camel-type locomotives were put on American rails. 5 are counted as survivors on almost every published list. That number is wrong, and the way it is wrong tells you how loose the record on this locomotive really is. 2 of the 5, Baltimore and Ohio, numbers 173 and 305, are Wynand's camels. Different builder, different decade, different problem, and a cab that sits on top of the boiler rather than straddling it. The B&O Museum draws that distinction itself when it describes its own equipment. 3 true Mother Hubbards are left on Earth. Central Railroad of New Jersey 592, a 442 Atlantic. Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western 952, a 440. Reading 1187, an 040 switcher, the Jersey Central ran camelbacks longer than anyone. Steam ended there on July 12, 1954, with engine 774 pulling the farewell trip. Number 592 had already made its last run on May 1st of that year from Jersey City to Baltimore into a museum. The final camelback in mainline service was cut up in 1956. 77 years after a French shop crew moved a cab to get an American engine through a tunnel. Now put the whole shape of it together. Wootten needed a grate wide enough to spread mine waste in a thin layer. Wide enough for that meant too wide to sit between the wheels, which meant it went above them, which meant there was no room left at the back of the engine for a cab. The crew got split, and the engineer got put over the rods because of the width. Then the same width made the mechanical stoker useless, and the stoker was the future. The same width lost its purpose the moment culm found a buyer. The same width was made unnecessary by a pair of small wheels at the rear of the frame. The feature that justified the danger is the feature that ended the machine. Nobody had to ban it. It was designed with its own expiration built into the one dimension that made it worth building. And that is the piece I keep turning over. This locomotive is remembered for a regulation that may never have been written and for deaths that nobody bothered to record, while the actual cause of its life and its death sits in an 1881 accounting column that almost nobody has read. 0.6 of a cent per 100-ton miles. That is the whole story. That is what the cab was moved for and what it stayed moved for, through 77 winters of firemen standing in the open at 70 miles an hour. Once you know what to look for, you will find that number behind a lot of American machines that got built strange and stayed strange, long after anyone remembered why. That is what American Ironworks does. Subscribe, and you will catch the next one.